Everything Old is New Again, America's entertainment pop culture talk show.
It may well possess a rudimentary intelligence.
I'm trying to think, but nothing happens.
Felt a great disturbance in the force.
Hello, I'm Mr. Red.
Come on, bark like a dog for me.
Where's the goodies? Leave the gun. Take the cannoli.
I bet you wouldn't have done anything like this if Mom and Dad were here.
You filthy criminal.
Excuse me while I whip this out.
Go ahead. Make my day.
Here are your hosts, Douglas Viviani and David Cohen.
Hot Point Quality Appliances presents America's favorite family comedy, The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, starring the entire Nelson family. The Nelsons' next-door neighbor, Mr. Thornberry, better known as Ozzie's pal Thorny, is played by Don Defore.
Now, Harriet and I have a little agreement. When the grass gets to be 4 inches high, I cut it.
Say, this isn't a bad idea. I think I'll work out a deal like this with my boy Will. I'll cut the grass when it's 4 inches high.
Well, where's Will fit into the picture?
Well, he can cut it when it's 3 inches high.
That way it'll never get to be 4 inches high.
That's okay, Oz. I'm a patient man.
There we go. A little bit of smart humor there from Everything Old is New Again, referring to the Ozzie and Harriet show. Now, this week, we are sans David Cohen. He's on special assignment, but fear not. We've been able to enlist a special guest to act as our co-host for the week. Now, I'll tell you, this is interesting. Don Defore has written a terrific biography about one of America's beloved movie and TV stars, his dad, Don Defore. Now, after performing in countless movies, sharing the screen with the likes of Bob Hope, Lucille Ball, Ronald Reagan, Martin and Lewis in their first movie, Spencer Tracy, Don Defore co-starred in what you may remember as the next-door neighbor in The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet. We saw and heard that just a minute ago. And also he was on the TV classic Hazel as Mr. B, I believe. During this time, his son Ron Defore, who was our guest, grew up in Anaheim, California on the weekends there and visited Disneyland, believe it or not, on a regular basis as his dad and uncle ran Don Defore's Silver Banjo Barbecue. We'll get into that. That was a restaurant in Frontierland in the late 50s and early 60s in Disneyland in California. Now, he's written a tremendous book called Growing Up in Disneyland, which is a biography of his dad, Don Defore, again, known for The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet and Hazel and all these movies. And so, therefore, it's somewhat of an autobiography also because he speaks to us in that book about growing up in and about Disneyland in the late 50s, early 60s. You could find the book on Amazon. Or if you want to get a signed copy, you can go to growingupindisneyland.com. That's growingupindisneyland.com. Welcome, Ron Defore to Everything Old is New Again.
Well, I'm glad to be with you and your audience. It should be fun.
It should be fun. You only have about a minute and a half left now with all that long introduction. I'm kidding. But I just want to start off a little bit about who your dad was. He's a kind of a guy, even all these years later, which we have to say is 50, 60 years later, from his, let's say, heyday in movies and television. If someone were to pull up his picture, I guarantee you go, that's I remember him. Oh, yeah, that's from Hazel. Oh, and people will remember your dad. Do you get that a lot when you're around a town and maybe pull out a picture or introduce who you are, that kind of thing, that people say, oh, yeah, sure, I remember that guy. I just didn't know his name, something like that?
Yeah, absolutely, and I make that clear in the book that I learned that at an early age, and it's one thing to know his name, which is not real common, even among baby boomers, but it's his picture, and that's why I knew that the cover of the book had to have more than just his name. It had to have what I think are the two most iconic pictures of my dad, and that is the one with Ozzie Nelson and the one with Shirley Booth as Hazel.
Right, exactly. And Hazel was on in reruns up till maybe, it still probably is now, but in New York anyway, up till, I would say, maybe 10 years ago. So people definitely recognize your dad. And then his good nature on the screen, the characters. He was sort of the next door neighbor before, Seinfeld had Kramer and all these other, and Bill Daly. Valley from My Dream of Jeannie and all. He was the precursor in some ways to those famous, if you will, next door neighbors, right? I mean, he was the Ozzie and Harriet next door neighbor for about 3 or 4 years, I guess you'd say, on the show, right?
He was their next door neighbor, Thorny, from 1952 to 1957. And you're correct that this was the early days of television. So my dad was one of the very first next-door neighbor roles in a regular weekly program on television.
Right, and Ricky Nelson himself, I'm just going to introduce a little bit of a quote here from him, and he's again was one of the children in The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, and later grew up to be a famous gentleman by himself. Don Defore was an extraordinary talent and played a pioneering role as one of the first straight men in sitcom television. As Thorny, the ever-supportive, omnipresent neighbor, he helped round out the Nelson household and made it a place we all wanted to call home. And that's what it was. Is he wasn't as outgoingly, demonstratively funny or silly as, let's say, Ed Norton, but he was more or less like a Bill Daly and, the good-natured next-door neighbor that, I guess I should say the neighbor that you'd want to have. Was he like that in real life? Did you have neighbors like that? Did he model that after anybody? Where do you think he got that impression from?
He got that from many different sources. He was a little bit like that in real life. He was also a little bit like Mr. B from the Hazel character. But he was a very good actor. And let me just say, the one thing that made the Ozzie and Harriet show with my dad so special is the chemistry particularly between my dad and Ozzie. And Ozzie and his brother wrote many of the scripts, and Ozzie, of course, directed. Ozzie didn't let his ego get in the way of humor. So you'll notice that a lot of scenes between my dad and Ozzie, my dad gets quite often the majority of laughs.
Right.
Now, somebody with too big of ego wouldn't have let that happen. So it's a good balance, and the chemistry, it was just amazing, which made the show, especially while my dad was on it, very funny.
Exactly, and you heard that in that opening clip there a little bit, where he was the one that got the laughs about cutting the grass, and I'll tell you, I think we all would recognize the voice of Hazel, at least on the radios, which we are. So I'll play a little bit of a clip, and let's see if this brings back some memories, since you mentioned that as well.
They don't usually agree on Mr. B's weight.
Hazel, I'll have a little more.
Oh, no, Mr. B, I don't think you better.
Or peace and quiet.
Hazel, will you please let me read my book?
Oh, I wouldn't think of disturbing you, Mr. B.
But in the end, he sees it her way.
Where there's a will, there's a way. Right, Mr. B?
Hazel, for once in my life, I agree with you 100%.
And I'll tell you, this book, Growing Up in Disneyland, is really interesting in that you also not only write it as an autobiography, and you write it as a biography of Dad, and then, of course, we get into Disneyland as well. But when you speak about Dad, it's almost sometimes you're talking with him, because there's some writings from your dad in the book as well. Can you explain that a little bit, how you wrote that in a novel way?
Yeah, well, when I decided to do the book, obviously I knew that the prime focus was my dad. It would be nothing without him. My life was a great life growing up with him, but he's the center of it. And when I decided to write it, I was a good month into researching the various productions that he was in prior to when I was born in 1950, and it took a whole month for it to dawn on me, I have his unpublished manuscript on my computer that has transferred from computer to computer for the last 30 years, and I thought, no, the way to do this thing is during that period, as much as possible, put it in his own words that he wrote. So, and many of the comments that I've already gotten on Amazon and elsewhere focus on that they love the way it goes back and forth between me and my dad, but to hear so much about the productions that he was in, right from him, they find very special.
It's almost like he wrote a diary or something of that nature, but I think these notes were just notes that he was preparing maybe to do another book himself or something, or what were the genesis of the notes?
He was working on a book.
Right.
In fact, I include the artwork on the book had it been published, but he died 3 months right after he finished it, and so it was never published. It was called Hollywood Before and After.
Great title. Well, this is a great title and a great read. Again, we're talking to Don Defore, who's written Growing Up in Disneyland, a biography of his dad and an autobiography of himself. His dad, of course, was in many movies. We'll talk about that down the line in this show. Also was in, as we've heard, Ozzie and Harriet, Hazel, and certainly now there's a big talk and discussion and reference to and enjoyment in this book about Disneyland. So we'll talk about that when we get back right here on Everything Old is New Again. Come on back. We'll be talking with Don Defore right after this.
You're listening to Everything Old is New Again, America's entertainment pop culture talk show with Douglas Viviani and David Cohen.
From one of the world's most gifted motion picture creators comes Disneyland, whose wondrous portals open to Adventureland, Tomorrowland, Frontierland, and Fantasyland. Fantasyland, where even elephants can fly, and little boys understand the simple language of the animals they love. Tomorrowland, taking you on miraculous trips to outer space, far beyond the orbits mankind has reached today. Adventureland, bringing you exciting stories of man's exploits and of the animals Walt Disney loves so well. Frontierland, where men of the mountains and men of the plains tame America's flaming frontiers. Disneyland.
Welcome back to Everything Old is New Again. We've done a few shows on Disneyland in the past and the background, but that was from the outside looking in. Now we have Don Defore, who grew up close to and, let's just say, on the premises of Disneyland for 3, 4, 5 years, and in his formative years. He'll tell us more about that. Growing Up Disneyland is the book on Amazon.com, or if you want to get a signed copy, you can go to the website to get a signed copy, and the website, I'm just struggling for it here. Ron, you have that handy? Is it?
Yeah, it's growingupindisneyland.com.
There we go. So that would be a pleasure to have that, and probably a good time to think about some gifts for the holidays coming up. So anyway, let's talk about this. Your dad, after he, or maybe even during his run in his career, met Walt Disney with respect to the Emmys. He was the first person that pushed for and was the force behind getting the Emmys on television, and Walt Disney loved that idea and wanted his show to win Emmys and so forth. So from there, I guess they developed a relationship. How did that, from the outside looking in, did you see them develop this relationship over time?
Well, yeah. Again, my dad was president of the Television Academy in 1954 and was the first to ever sell the national broadcast of the Emmy Awards to NBC, and Walt himself had been on the board, and when he called to congratulate my dad, said, Don, I can tell you, me and many others had tried to do this for several years and failed, so I congratulate you. So he invited my dad out to the Burbank studios for a personal tour, and among what my dad saw were some highly guarded sound stages that included a lot of the animatronics that would soon go into Disneyland. And fast forward to the opening day parade, July 17th, 1955, my whole family was in the opening day parade in the Autopia cars riding up Main Street, which is the photo that I have on the front of the book. And then a year and a half later, he was asked to open open up a barbecue restaurant in Frontierland. But what I always have to say when I'm talking about the book is this book is not all about Disneyland. There are 3 chapters dedicated to my experience growing up there, and a lot of fun, different things, what kids would do if they got totally bored with Disneyland. But the bulk of it, as you've indicated earlier, is my dad's career and mine as well.
Exactly, and just as an aside, though, for this section, I think it's interesting. Play this in the background here. Maybe this will set the tone for us a little bit here, because your dad then, from his relationship, was able to parlay that into Don Defore's Silver Banjo Barbecue Restaurant, as we mentioned previously, in Frontierland, which was unusual that it was the only food facility named in the park to have a name after a live person. And then Dave Smith of the Walt Disney Archives says that Walt obviously was good friends with Don and trusted him to sell a quality product at his park. So from what I'm reading in the book, though, too, this was a family affair. At some point in time, you were involved, or in some way at least were invited to and spent the weekends at Disneyland while that establishment was being run. Is that correct?
We were down there many weekends, and during the summer, weeks at a time, and we had a second home that my dad had to get right near the park in Anaheim. Our main home was further north in Brentwood. But yeah, I mean, we were there so many times that we got bored with the park, which some of my friends that have annual passes and they love going there, 3-4 times a week. I don't understand that, because I did that, and you get bored after a while, and the stories, some of the stories we tell are what kids would do when they got bored, and that's also why some folks at Disney are not real pleased with the book, because they don't want me encouraging other kids to do some of the shenanigans we did.
Right, some of the behind-the-scenes things. It's very interesting. I won't go into too many of them because it ruin the stories, because they're really fun, great stories. But let's just focus then a little bit on some of the rides because Disney is blowing up now, of course, and they've got Star Wars, and there's just so many different lands, and it's huge. But back in the day, while it was big, it wasn't like it is now, and they've modified some rides. Do you remember this submarine voyage? You must have been an expert at all of these rides, done them tons of times, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, we were VIP guests at the 1959 opening of the submarine ride. It was actually the opening of the submarine ride and the monorail, and so it was a big ceremony. So we were one of the first to ride that. But there was also some rides where the Defore kids were asked to test them. The old flying saucer ride that did not last too long, but it was in Tomorrowland. I remember them calling over to the restaurant and telling us to get over there. And these were not yet flying saucers. They were round pieces of plywood that they were testing to make sure that they would float with a kid sitting on top. So my brother and I are sitting on these plywood things, and they're using boxes of nails to kind of balance the thing out. And these were the days before there were a lot of lawyers around. I'm sure they could never get away with this today.
Right. I mean, and if you look at, if you wanted to get an idea of what it is on the radio here, it's like a mini hovercraft for one person, and they would use them as bumper cars. It only lasted 5 years there, and they called them flying saucers. But it looked like a lot of fun when you tested it out. Did you then see it, of course, develop into the ride it was, and then ride it after that, and have a little bit of pride, maybe, that you were one of the first to do so?
Oh, yeah, sure. It was great to see it come to fruition. The ride, though, just the way it was engineered and the mechanics, they could never quite get it to work out. It had constant problems, was constantly broke down, and that's ultimately why it was replaced by other attractions.
And another one that was difficult for them was this, and it was sort of, I think, may have ended just about when you were getting there. Maybe you tell me, the Rainbow Mountain Stagecoach ride. Do you remember this one?
I got to be honest with you. No,
Yeah.
I don't remember.
It may be a
that.
smidge before you. Just as an example, it's just basically guest-boarded stagecoaches and wagons and buckboards drawn by horses. And they'd run them all over the place, but these things would overturn all the time, so it didn't work too well for them.
Yeah, that would have been prior to 1957, but before we had the restaurant. So
Right.
that's why I don't have a strong memory of that.
Now, how about the, I don't know, this wouldn't even sound that interesting, but the Rainbow Caverns Mine Train, do you remember this one?
Oh, sure.
And so that went through, it was a train ride, which must have been kind of cool, but it looked like it just went through like an inside, like glacier kind of, I don't know, attraction. It didn't have a lot going on, or did it? You tell me.
Yeah, it did just as you described it, and rides like that, we would get to watch the building of them, and sometimes they'd let us take a peek behind the scenes of what the attraction was going to be like. So that was pretty special.
And then finally, there's the Skyway. It's almost a gondola, like, we all, during our skiing days, have done this before. But back in 56, 57, 58, I think it was one of the first times there was a gondola anywhere. And there was a gondola skylift that went from I think from Fantasyland to Tomorrowland. Do you remember that at all, or is that too dangerous?
Yeah, no. I have in the book a joke, but we actually used to do it. I say that if you were ever at Disneyland in either Tomorrowland or Frontierland or Fantasyland, underneath the Skyway on a clear sunny day, and you felt it raining, the Defore kids were probably up in one of the buckets with empty Disneyland cups.
which now you can come full circle if you had that happen, or even if not, and want to get a copy of the book Growing Up in Disneyland signed. Go ahead, go to growingupindisneyland.com, or of course you can go to Amazon and buy the book as well. It's a great book about Disney, but it's also, again, we're going to come back to Ron Defore, who's written Growing Up in Disneyland, a biography of his dad, Don Defore, and we'll talk a little bit more back to some Hollywood discussion. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about who you've met through the travels and see what that brings us here on Everything Old is New Again. We'll be right back right after this.
All right, so Doug, people have been saying, hey, I could find you guys on YouTube. You have your own YouTube channel. I can find you on Facebook. But what about other social media? Do you exist anywhere else in the social media universe?
Yes, we do. We're on Instagram and we're on Twitter. At the same thing, you go at EONA Show. That's Everything Old is New Again. The initials, right? So it's EONA Show. And that's it, at EONA Show. You got Instagram, Twitter, and I'll tell you, we post pictures, behind-the-scenes stuff, trivia questions, contests, notes about the show, so you have a lot of fun. Subscribe to us, friend us on Facebook if you can, and subscribe to the YouTube, and follow us on Twitter and Instagram.
That's fun. I'm going to even start doing that.
It might be worth your while. You can actually know what we're going to do next week.
Good.
At EONA Show. That's at EONA Show.
Now, back to America's entertainment pop culture talk show. Everything Old is New Again, with Douglas Viviani and David Cohen.
Yeah. Those are the Beatles, those are. And this is Beatleland, formerly known as Britain, where an epidemic called Beatlemania has seized the teenage population, especially female. Wherever the Beatles go, they are pursued by hordes of screaming, swinging juveniles. Thousands of teenagers in every city and town stand in line all night to get tickets for their touring show. Girls faint when the tickets run out.
He doesn't sound too excited about that, does he? This is Everything Old is New Again. We're listening there to an old report from 1964 from CBS, and a rather unenthusiastic reporter talking about the Beatles. Later on, I bet you he regretted that attitude. Who knows? Let's talk about this. I have a guest with us here, and Everything Old is New Again, the author of Growing Up in Disneyland, which is Ron Defore, and it's a biography of his dad, Don Defore, as well as an autobiography of himself. GrowingUpInDisneyland.com, GrowingUpInDisneyland.com to get an autographed copy, which I think would be a great idea for the holidays coming up. Now, I mentioned the Beatles because in a little bit of research, of course, I read the book, but besides that, there's a 19-second video that's on YouTube of the Beatles allegedly in the backyard, or in your backyard, Ron, at, I'm going to call it a gathering or a party. Was that you putting up there? Is that legitimate? Let's start with that.
Well, yes, it is. This was a fundraiser for the Hemophilia Society of Los Angeles, and an invitation came to my dad, and at dinner he says, "Oh, kids, we got a invitation to meet the Beatles. Do you know what Beatles are?" Well, of course, we said, "Yeah, let's go." And he said, "Well, they're $25 a ticket. That's pretty expensive." I said, "Well, we need to go anyway." So this was a private invitation fundraiser in the backyard of Arlen Spector's mother-in-law's house in Brentwood. He didn't use his own house because it was being renovated, so that's where it was, in their backyard. And this was August 24th, 1964, part of their first U.S. tour. And only a handful of celebrities and their families were invited. Edward G. Robinson was there, Hedda Hopper, Lloyd Bridges, I could go on, a number of celebrities, including our family, and no media was allowed inside. So I happened to have my brand new 8mm camera, and as I've learned over the years, I'm the only one with moving pictures of that event. And I also found out from one of the Apple documentary producers that I'm apparently the only one that has a ticket to that event. He originally told me there were no tickets, and I said, I beg to differ. I've got mine right with the black and white photos of me shaking hands with the Beatles. So it was very special, and yeah, I didn't want to put the entire video up there because it's copyrighted, but I took about, like you said, about 18 seconds of it, and it's on my YouTube channel for people to see.
So there is more to it than meets the eye, so to speak, on the video on YouTube. But what you do see, I believe now, because let me just take a guess here, because I think I saw them all in sort of like their uniform, where they were all wearing the same outfits. Was that the case or no?
Yeah, and they were lined up on tall stools in the backyard, and everybody attendee got to go by, shake their hands, say something to them, and then there was a photographer that took shots of each family. I've got 2 or 3 black and whites of our family shaking hands with them.
That's terrific. And what was your, how can I ask, generally speaking, were you a teen or preteen at the time, and what was your impression of them?
I was 13 years old, and I had just started playing guitar and had a band in middle school, and so I remember exactly what I said to Paul. He was the first in line. I shook his hand, and I said, I've got a rock group, and I want you to know we play a lot of your songs. Not that he would care, but, I didn't know what else to say.
And what was his response? Yeah, it's great, kid.
Oh, he just smiled and said, "That's great," in an English accent.
Right. Oh, that's great to hear that behind the scenes too, and we've all heard this, that they were pretty much what you saw on the camera and off the camera. They were good-natured gentlemen that took this, still take it in stride, it seems, which is interesting. Now, the question is, you've been through Hollywood, lived in Brentwood, which where a lot of the Hollywood stars live and lived, and growing up there, and of course in the Disneyland area in Anaheim as well. But with respect to Hollywood, do you see, like, it seems like in the book that the Hollywood celebrities, which we may talk about and hit upon next section, but let's talk about this for a second. They seem to have been, and the impression is that they're more or less the ones that you met were down to earth people and sort of like the next door neighbor and friendly and was that the impression? And do you think it's the same now if you have any experience with Hollywood today?
Well, I'll answer that last one first. It's absolutely not like it was in the 50s or 60s.
Right.
It's really a shame. It was really special when I grew up, and I was very fortunate that my parents were fairly conservative. They were not part of the, Hollywood party scene. They kept us fairly isolated. In fact, the house that my dad had built in 1947 on Mandeville Canyon and Mandeville Lane, he bought 2 lots. And people at the studio were saying, Don, why are you building way out in the country? And in those days, it was pretty far out. There weren't that many houses. In the first 5, 6, 7 years of me growing up there, we had a cow, chickens, ducks in the background. And so it was a very neighborhood, a typical non-celebrity neighborhood, even though a lot of celebrities were there. So nobody was too impressed with themselves.
Right.
Richard Widmark lived across the street. Dick Van Dyke, Carl Reiner, Rob Reiner lived up the street. Anthony Caruso, the great character actor, was directly across the street. Meredith Willson, the composer of Music Man. I mean, I could go on and on. And
right.
But these are people that were within a half a mile, and they were neighbors and people that we played with when we were kids.
So you say it's interesting because you say neighbors now. I mean, there's a comedian that does a routine about this, Maniscalco, where the doorbell rings now and everybody scatters around and hides and doesn't want to answer the door and who's coming unannounced. Back in the day, there was in all of our society, it was a different world where you invited people in. Let's have some cake, or let's visit for a couple of hours, or even a half hour just to say hello. And so neighbors meant something different back then. And I think what you're saying also, it's possible that, who knows, maybe you're saying that Dick Van Dyke at least would wave as he went by, or you'd have a barbecue and maybe one of these people would show up with your neighbors, and so you got to know people a little bit more than we do now. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I have a great story that my mom tells about a Christmas Eve where since it was my sister's birthday on Christmas, she would always want us to go to a certain restaurant. So when we came back, the house was normally just laden with all sorts of Christmas lights. I mean, people remember the Defore family house during Christmas. Well, we Christmas Eve got back late, and it was dark already, and the lights were not on. We get right in, and somebody's banging at the front door. My mom presses the intercom. Yeah, who's this? And he says, "This is Meredith Wilson, your neighbor up the street. When are you going to turn on your lights?" And she says, "Well, I don't know. We may or may not." Kind of cocky. And he says, "No, please, Marion, you got to turn them on. I'm having a big party tonight, and on the invitation it says turn left at the house that's all lit up with Christmas lights."
How about that? That's tremendous. She was messing up the party instructions at the very least. That's great. We're talking with Ron Defore, who's written Growing Up in Disneyland, the biography of his dad, Don Defore, and he gets a lot of these stories in the book and much more. It's a great read. I guess, of course, Don was known, his dad, for Ozzie and Harriet and Hazel and a lot of movies, which we'll talk about in our next section. Certainly the touch of discussion about living, so to speak, or visiting many, many times Disneyland. And so if you want to get a autographed copy, which I think is a great idea, growingupindisneyland.com, growingupindisneyland.com. And of course, if you want to go to Amazon, feel free to do that as well. It's called Growing Up in Disneyland. It's a great read. It's a lot of fun. We will be right back right after this. On Everything Old is New Again, we'll talk about a little bit some more about some Hollywood stars and Ron and growing up in the Hollywood heyday, let's say. We'll be back right after this. On Everything Old is New Again.
This is Everything Old is New Again, America's entertainment pop culture talk show. with Douglas Viviani and David Cohen.
Now, here's the favor I want you to do.
What is it?
Go like this.
Maybe I didn't hear you correctly. What is that?
Keep doing it. Repeat it. Go ahead.
There's a song in the air for the fair.
There we are. A little bit from Martin and Lewis, the first movie, My Friend Irma. This is Everything Old is New Again. We are celebrating Ron Defore, who has written a book, Growing Up in Disneyland, is a biography of his dad, Don Defore, who you know for sure was the next-door neighbor from The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet as the chief, what would you say, I don't know, foil for Hazel in those television shows. And there's been a ton of movies that he was in, one of which certainly was Martin and Lewis in My Friend Irma from 1949, their first film. He was also, and I think it's just amazing to think about this, he was in a movie with Bob Hope and Lucille Ball, The Facts of Life in 1960, even Doris Day in Romance on the High Seas in 48. Throwing any of those out there, how about Spencer Tracy in 30 Seconds Over Tokyo in 44 with Van Johnson and Robert Mitchum? There's got to be some interest there when you're a child growing up, although a lot of these you were very young, but maybe the later ones, especially in the 60s, they were Bob Hope, where Dad had to come back from the set maybe with a story or two, or did he keep it all close to the vest?
Dad rarely brought his work home. So, and my sister and I were just talking the other night that we're kind of sorry that we didn't ask more questions about what he was doing. But it relates to one of the points that I make in the book, is that I was never really impressed with anything related to celebrities or movie making, TV making, because it was all around me. To me, it was like that's the way life is. It wasn't until years later, and talking to people and telling stories and everything, and everybody going, God, you ought to write a book, that it dawned on me that I had a pretty special upbringing, and again, I wish I had paid more attention and asked my dad a lot more questions.
Right, exactly. I'm sure he's got in his notes there some references. One that I wanted to talk about, since we're just around the holiday season here, and we've seen Christmas Story 600 times, and I love it. Don't get me wrong, and It's a Wonderful Life, and there's a lot of great holiday movies. But one that I think is we are all searching sometimes for the next good holiday movie to share. How about It Happened on Fifth Avenue, starring your dad and some others? What did you feel or think about that when that was when? Well, I guess the first question is: did you see a lot of films that your dad was in, like first run? Did he tell you about them and say, "Hey, let's go see them"? Or how did that happen? And then, by the way, what do you think of It Happened on Fifth Avenue?
Well, a lot of questions there. Yeah. First of all, I did not see the first run because most of the big ones that he made were made before I was born in 1950. Right. So we would watch them occasionally on reruns, but they were so new that not a lot of stations were rerunning these films. So there were a lot of these films I didn't really see until 20, 30 years later. And now It Happened on Fifth Avenue has really gained a lot of popularity just in the last 15, 20 years as Turner Classic Movies and some others play that right around Christmas time. And it's very similar to It's a Wonderful Life, as well as Miracle on 34th Street. And I get comments all the time on my Don Defore fan club Facebook group of people saying, that is absolutely the best Don Defore movie that they like.
And so I'm sure TCM will be playing that. So set your VCR. We don't have VCR. Say to myself, but set your DVR for It Happened on Fifth Avenue. It is a treat. It is something to see, and it's nice to see something that. Our show is Everything Old is New Again. Let's face it, the old movies or the movies and creations that existed back in the day that come back to light now. We like to put a spotlight, so to speak, on some of these, and this is perfect because it's really something that you haven't seen that, you will. If you haven't seen it, you will enjoy it, and it's brand new for you now. And certainly all of our entertainment of the past is, the foundation for what we see to this day. So I would recommend that as well. There's a movie out right now about Judy Garland, and I know this is, of course, before you were born, but she was the matron of honor at your parents' wedding. Did she remain in touch, and years and years later, before her untimely passing, when you were around to remember any experiences with her at all?
Not so much. I mean, a lot of staying in touch in Hollywood land is sending Christmas cards to each other. So that's kind of the staying in touch. Now, I did have somewhat of a connection that one of my girlfriends in middle school was Lorna Luft, Judy's one of her daughters. Right. That didn't last long. She's a lot better looking now than she was back then. But they lived right up the street. I didn't mention her earlier, but there were all sorts of stars. Pat O'Brien lived right next to her as well.
Well, somebody your dad did keep in touch with, though, and he participated a little bit, I think, in his political life was Ronald Reagan, President Ronald Reagan, and they certainly acted previously in 1952, I guess, when you were 2 years old, and she's working her way through college. But thereafter, when President Reagan was president, your dad was still in touch, right?
Well, not only in touch, but my dad campaigned extensively for Reagan for not only the California governorship, but for president. And he was also a Republican delegate at both the 76 and 1980 Republican conventions. That led to him getting a political appointment. It also led to me getting 3 different political appointments, and that's what brought me back east to Washington, D.C.
And it must have been a thrill, and as you look back now, these things are thrust upon us when we're young and we're in the midst of it, but now when you look back on it, it's such a historical time and presidency that to be a part of. Your dad must have been very proud as well, huh?
Oh, I was very proud as well, and my dad was a prolific letter writer, so I just recently went up to the Reagan Library in Simi Valley, California, and brought with me a big binder of personal letters that my dad had received from Reagan, some of them handwritten, and I sat down with the director, and he was just in awe. He said, "You got to scan these for us, because it's not often that we see, a lot of these personal letters to one person, and particularly handwritten."
Yeah, that's amazing. And Reagan did, for an understand, write a lot, especially when he was convalescing from that unfortunate event where he got shot. He was and he wrote a lot of correspondence in handwriting then, but he did it all the time. And I think it's what a throwback, but really is incredible. It just reminds me back when Lincoln's on the train up to Gettysburg, and he's writing and handwriting his speech, the Gettysburg Address. And I'm not saying Reagan wrote that, but it just shows you when you're hands-on and when you have that intelligence about you, it comes out and when you're writing something by hand. No one else wrote what he wrote to your dad. It must have been very special. Obviously, keep all of that. Now, we're talking with Ron Defore, Growing Up in Disneyland, a biography of his dad, Don Defore. Of course, known for all we're talking about here and more. We're just touching upon a little bit here. You got to dive into this book, Growing Up in Disneyland. Get an autographed copy. Why not? And you can do that by going to growingupindisneyland.com. Growingupindisneyland.com. And I think that would be a great, great gift. Give that along with maybe your tape It Happened on Fifth Avenue. You've got a nice combination there for the holidays. Listen, it's been a great time that we've had to spend with you. I've got a minute or two. The last time your dad was on film was in St. Elsewhere and TV with Denzel Washington. Did he bring anything back from any of the events on that he was on all these TV shows and with all these stars? What was special about your dad that you would say in a minute here to entice us, to let us know what a gentleman he was and what a great read this book is?
Well, the best thing I can do is suggest people join us on the Facebook group that I've sponsored for more than 20 years, the Don Defore Fan Club, where you can share your experiences and see other people's comments about how loved and appreciated my dad was in the various roles that he played.
Loved and beloved for sure. Get your autographed copy, growingupindisneyland.com. If you for some reason can't remember that, you can go to Amazon, of course. Growing Up in Disneyland by Ron Defore. Ron, thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it. Wish you all the best with the book, and thanks for spending some time with Everything Old is New again.
Thank you, Douglas.
All right, great. We'll look forward to hearing from you again soon. We'll be back next week for more pop culture entertainment. Take us out, Bob.
Of sentimental verse, nothing in my purse, and chuckles when the preacher said...
Everything Old is New Again is sponsored by the law office of Douglas Viviani. Douglas Viviani has been providing quality legal service for over 26 years. We're a general practice firm and can handle any legal matter you may have for a reasonable fee. If you're involved in a car accident, starting a business, planning your estate, or need a criminal attorney, please call 631-681-1910 or email us at vivianilaw@aol.com for a free consultation. Get the justice you deserve. Contact the law office of Douglas Viviani at vivianilaw@aol.com.
You've been listening to Everything Old is New Again, America's pop culture entertainment talk show. Find us on the web at everythingoldisnewagain.biz. That's .biz.
See you next week. Same bat time, same bat station.